Hello, and thank you all for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar in our CWSRF series. Today's session is on navigating federal regulations. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for the session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or if you need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Ashley Lucht. Ashley is a director at Quantified Ventures. Welcome, Ashley, and I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, welcome everybody, and buckle up because the next hour plus is going to be a deep dive into all the exciting requirements of this clean water SRF. I don't know how much background participants have had in terms of what the clean water SRF will fund, but essentially, the Clean Water SRF can fund a wide variety of clean water projects. I know that sounds redundant, but anything that'll kind of address water quality, improve water quality. I think many of you will think that it's typically like wastewater projects, like collection system, treatment systems, pump stations, sort of the traditional gray infrastructure. But just know that the Clean Water SRF can fund sort of a wide variety of natural infrastructure projects, stormwater projects, nature-based solution, things of that nature. So what makes this even more complicated is that some of the federal regulations will apply to some of the projects, but not all. But what I'm going to do today to avoid confusion is I'm just going to talk about all of the regulations that apply to the Clean Water SRF and remind you that every state is different and it depends. This is the mantra I need everybody to remember and to repeat over and over again. Every state is different and it depends. So we're going to start with cross-cutters that are considered equivalency cross-cutters. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you as a borrower will need to worry about. States need to worry about ensuring that certain projects that equal a certain dollar amount follow kind of this list of cross-cutters. But what it means for you as a borrower is it means that you may have to meet these requirements. So again, I'm not going to be like, okay, raise your hand if you have a pump station project that's funded with federal funds. Not going to do that. I'm just going to go through all of the requirements as though they apply to every project. So the first one I want you to remember, and if you don't remember anything else about this presentation, I want you to remember this specific requirement. So it is collectively called architectural and engineering procurement. However, it is also known as qualifications-based selection or request for qualifications. So this requirement basically says that in order to have your engineering services eligible for SRF funding, you need to choose your engineer or your architecture based solely on qualifications. And what this also means is that you can't ask for a scope of services at the onset. You can't ask for kind of their schedule of rates at the onset. You are solely looking for an engineer's or architect's experience and applicability to the project you're looking to do. And the reason why I say this is so important is because many people will choose it's why I say it's important to know at the onset is many communities will choose their engineer long before they know which funding program they're going to go after, whether it's SRF, whether it's USDA, whether it's some other acronym. So ensuring that you, the borrower, you, the community, have chosen your engineering firms based on the qualifications that you want is so important. Now, most states have a template or an outline that you can use to certify that you've done RFQ appropriately. But if not, then you may need to just contact the state directly. It would be unfortunate if they don't have something on their websites that kind of walk you through FAQs and templates, but some of them don't. So again, really important to remember this. The next really important item that all projects, regardless of the funding agency or the type of money behind it, as long as it's associated with federal money, is going to be an environmental review. So when we're talking environmental review, we're talking about the direct and indirect impacts of a project on, quote, resources. And so what are we talking about when we say resources? So this is just kind of a quick rundown. I know you're like, wow, those are a lot of things that I need to check to make sure that my project is not going to impact. And yeah, that's true. However, some of these are just easy checkoffs. Like if you're doing a water line project or a collection system project and it is sort of existing, then you're probably not going to be impacting any endangered species. So a lot of these are going to be just quick checks that you can write off as part of your environmental review. But in terms of kind of the big picture of the procedure, essentially what you as the borrower or community, usually through your engineer, is going to put together, it's most likely going to be part of like a preliminary engineering report or some sort of planning document, is when you are going, you're going to start evaluating the environmental impacts of the project. And then once you've sort of settled on the project that you want to go forward with, that's where you're going to put together the project information, looking through kind of all of these overarching requirements. So your engineer is going to put together a document that kind of says, yes, yeah, we're not going to impact endangered species. No, we're not going to be polluting the air. This is in the public good, words, words, words. And you are going to submit to the state review department. Sometimes it's the state revolving loan fund program. Sometimes it's the engineering program. And the state is going to determine whether the project qualifies for categorical exclusion, or whether you need to go a little bit further. If you need to go a little bit further, that doesn't necessarily mean that the project is done or that you can't do it. It just means that there needs to be another level of review on the potential impacts and proposed mitigation measures that the project is proposing. And sort of depending on if the mitigation measures are satisfied, then you will get a finding of no significant impact. There will be records of decision. There's a public notice process and a public participation process. But just know that this is very critical to getting any project funded. And frankly, again, regardless of the funding agency, an environmental review needs to be completed. The good news is most states have a mechanism to allow the vast majority of projects to be categorically excluded. And basically what that means is they're like, hey, dude, we've seen these projects before. We know what's happening with them. They're not going to have any cumulative impact, because the reality is that it's most likely just replacing something that's already there. And so that falls under this sort of like quick, like get out of jail free card environmental report. The borrower still needs to present the information to the state, but the state can basically say like, all right, well, we're going to pass go. We're just going to say this project's good. We're going to give you a categorical exclusion, and you are on to the next requirement. On to the next requirement. So this is something that is unique to the Clean Water SRF. For those of you who work in both the drinking water and the clean water programs, Fiscal Sustainability Plan, or FSP, does not have a corollary requirement on the drinking water side. Essentially, an FSP is a self-certification from the borrower that says, on my honor, I promise that I have a plan in place for the replacement of the project that I am doing. Some say, like me, it's kind of like an asset management light type of document. Again, this is a self-certification. The states could choose to sort of call on it. They could say, hey, show me your FSP for this project. And so it behooves you to do it. But again, this is only for the project that is getting constructed with the loan that is being applied for. This doesn't have to apply to the entire system. And so there are some really nice examples out there of FSP certification forms or best practices, FAQs, things of that nature. So these are a few of them that exist. Full disclosure, I used to be Vermont's drinking water SRF program manager for the vast majority of my career. So I am a little biased towards Vermont's SRF program. That's not why it's on here. It's on here because it actually has a really good example. So another requirement that is unique to the Clean Water SRF program is cost and effectiveness. So it's exactly like it says. Basically, like the borrower needs to certify, and again, this has to go through, this typically goes through the engineering firm. Basically, it has to certify that, yep, I looked at all of the options, and this is the best one based on cost and effectiveness. These two, FSP and C&E, came out of the 2014 WRDA amendments. So that's why if some of you are relatively new to the SRF or kind of like were around in the beginning and then took a nap and now came back, some of these are like, well, I don't remember any of this stuff. Well, yeah, because Congress gifted us with these lovely requirements in 2014. So again, self-certification, most states have like a form that you have to certify this needs to be part of the kind of loan application, or the funding application, I should say. Project planning, I know this sounds like, well, thanks, Captain Obvious. I know we have to plan our project, but there are some specific documents that are required as part of the Clean Water SRF. For those of you who operate a wastewater facility, you know that there are those 20-year facility plans that are required typically by the state. Those tend to be kind of the like, this is when we need to do the work, and this is when we should be implementing it. It does take into account environmental impacts and things of that nature. Sort of a more detailed document that accompanies a discrete project is a preliminary engineering report. And this is kind of getting into the brass tacks of going deep down into the like, well, this is how this machine works, or this piece of equipment works versus this other piece of equipment, and this one costs this. I mean, you understand. I don't need to engineer explain this this work to you, but these are fundamental documents that are part of any good clean water SRF project, but also any functioning wastewater or clean water system. Again, part of the SRF process, there's always going to be a level of engineering and technical review. Now, every state is different, and it depends on the type of project that is being proposed. But generally speaking, this is the sort of march of a project. You start with a preliminary engineering report that then results in a chosen project, which then you apply for permits for. Project plans are produced as part of the final design. Those project plans go into bid documents. The SRF program will review those bid documents, and those ultimately will result in construction contracts. And so the SRF program on the state side is often heavily involved in every step of this process, because as we're talking about right now, there are mountains of federal regulations that need to be sort of checked against at every step. Because obviously if the project doesn't meet those requirements, it may make them ineligible for SRF funding. The state also has a requirement to ensure that the money is being spent in accordance with federal law. And if it isn't, then the state could get penalized. And that would ultimately affect the borrowers, because if the state gets penalized, there might not be as much money. You can see how that is a domino effect. So one note about the Clean Water SRF's Green Project Reserve Fund. We hear a lot of people, especially with the mountain of infrastructure money through bill and even IRA that's funneling through the SRFs. Well, IRA is not funneling through the SRFs, but bill certainly is. People are like, oh, GPR, like we hear that, like that's free money, right? In addition to all the other free money out there. The reality is GPR is it is a strong suggestion that the state SRF program identify 10% of the annual capitalization grant in projects that qualify as green projects. So you'll see the 4 types of green projects here. What is not required, it is not required by EPA that those projects receive additional subsidy or any other kind of incentive. There's no requirement that grants are awarded to the green projects. There's no requirement that a reduction in interest rate. There's not even a requirement that these projects be elevated in terms of priority ranking or funding. So it's more like a bookkeeping requirement. So again, this is kind of like, if we're talking about like top 5 things to take away from this, GPR does not equal free money. Davis-Bacon. Now we're getting into the really fun stuff. Davis-Bacon is a wage requirement. It came out of the was it Public Works Amendment from the 1930s that said, okay, everybody needs to be paid an equal wage. Like you can't treat some people like second-class citizens and paying them 50 cents. Well, maybe in 1931 they were paying them 50 cents. But you can't pay them 50 cents when you're paying some other person $1 for the same work. And this requirement has sort of held tight. It hasn't gone away and it hasn't been updated. So the unfortunate thing is that because it hasn't been updated to keep in line with inflation, is essentially any federal loan is going to be greater than $2,000, and so Davis-Bacon will apply. And there are a lot of requirements on both the borrower side and the contractor side to kind of keep track of what's going on, like who's getting paid, how much they're getting paid, what type of work they're doing on the job. So on the borrower side, and this again is typically handled by your RPR or resident project representative, or your which is also could be the engineering firm. So the engineering firm is collecting a lot of this information for you, unless of course you're a larger community and you have a city engineer or something that's tasked with project managing. But essentially, this is the borrower's responsibility as it relates to Davis-Bacon. And then there's the contractor's responsibility as it relates to Davis-Bacon. And there is a requirement that the prevailing wages be posted somewhere. Typically, this is in the, was it like the contractor's trailer on site? I have a colleague who teaches this training with me, and he was the longtime CWSRF engineer for the state of Rhode Island, and I'm stealing this story from him because it's so good that there was a project that lasted 3 weeks maybe, and they didn't have a construction trailer, so they ended up posting all of these requirements on the inside of the porta potty door, because, well, it needed to be someplace where everybody could see it, and, well, everybody could see the inside of the porta potty door. So just some levity here. Another everyone's favorite requirement. So American Iron and Steel came to us through, it is kind of grown up. It started off with ARA, the first stimulus in 2009, as Buy American, and it has evolved over the decade to grow up to become American Iron and Steel. So AIS, as it's collectively known as, now applies to all SRF projects. It doesn't matter whether they're federally funded, whether they're funded with repayment funds, whether it's a grant, whether it's 100% forgiven. It does not matter. If $1 of SRF funds are in a project, AIS applies across the board. And this applies to only iron and steel projects, or components that are made out of iron and steel that are permanently incorporated into the project and are, quote, listed. And you're like, well, what does listed mean? Well, listed means right here, the second bullet, for like the second item. So there are specific types of projects that have been called out that must meet AIS requirements. Also, the product has to be made of more than 50%, the product that has more than 50% of its material cost made up of iron and steel. Also, you need to keep in mind permanently part of the project. So for example, a trench box, because it's not permanently incorporated, does not have to meet AIS requirements. If that trench box accidentally stays, then yes, it does. Other pieces like spare and backup parts that you wouldn't necessarily think about. So if there are couplings or fittings or things of that nature that you're like, well, we just have extra, those need to be, and they are paid for with the loan and could be incorporated into the system at some point. Those also need to be AIS certified. Another part that people often forget is rebar in concrete. Again, the rebar, because it is a component and it is a listed product that needs to be AIS certified. The good news, though, is there are a number of things that don't need to be AIS. So I think the biggest one that is a benefit to water systems, I'm showing my bias again, systems, is the mechanical and electrical equipment. So if it has moving parts, it does not need to meet AIS requirements. And of course, there are other things like appurtenances to those mechanical equipment. So if there is a pump that is made in Switzerland, but the arms that hold the pump to the ground are made in China, none of that needs to be AIS certified because the arms are appurtenant to the pump. So that's good news. So the certification letter that needs to accompany any piece of iron or steel, it needs to come from the manufacturer. That is really important to know. Now, manufacturers have been doing this for a couple of years, so they're getting better and getting really good at just sort of being very clear of ticking off all of these things. But I would say the most important thing is that it needs to come from the manufacturer and it needs to be signed by a company representative. And it needs to identify the location and name of the project. There are a few waivers that exist. I would say the least likely of getting a waiver, the least type of waiver that you're likely to get would be a public interest waiver. The cost waiver, though, is probably the one that you are more likely to receive if you need to apply. And then there are some sort of de minimis or just because waivers. And really it comes down to like the small components of an overall project that the waiver will address, or excuse me, small components of the project. So things like nuts and bolts, those are just such a small component of the overall project that trying to certify every single nut and bolt is really difficult. And then of course there's the minor components waiver. Everybody's new favorite requirement is Buy America, Build America, or BABA. So where AIS applied only to iron and steel components, and then of course there were thresholds there, BABA applies to all the things, all the manufactured products, all the construction material, all the everything. And all the everything needs to be produced in the United States. Also very different from AIS is AIS is like an EPA only requirement, whereas BABA applies to all of the federal money, and it was tied to bill. So AIS, again, very sort of narrow in terms of the funding program that it applies to and who your contact is and who can make up the rules. BABA is on a different level. It's like big kid stuff. Now, this is where at the beginning of the presentation, I said there are some requirements that need to be met only by those projects that are funded with federal funds. So in the revolving loan fund world, there is federal money, there's state match money, and there's repayment money. So when we're talking about certain requirements meeting federal dollar, equaling federal dollar amounts, it's that federal money that's coming in. And BABA is one of these requirements that only applies to the dollar amount coming in from the federal government, not state match and not revolved funds. So states could choose a smaller subset of projects funded to have BABA apply to. Now you're thinking, how do I get on that list? And really, it's at the state's discretion. There are some states that have all of these requirements apply to all of the projects because, frankly, it's easier on them. It's easier for them to say, okay, here's all the requirements. I, the state, am not going to have to keep track of who's on first and what's on second. There are other states, though, who regularly lend to very large communities or large cities who may be more savvy in implementing some of these requirements. So there may be other states which are going to pick and choose and say, you, big city USA, are the lucky recipient of having to comply with BABA, in addition to some other requirements. I don't necessarily think one way is better than another. It really depends. Here we go again. It depends, and every state is different. It depends on the capacity, frankly, of the state to implement some of these programs. And as we know, many states are understaffed, overworked, and they are dealing with this onslaught of federal requirements that if you think it's hard to know about, try being a state program having to deal with kind of all of the changes that are coming out in the last couple of years. But okay, off of my soapbox for a little bit. So what else? All right, so these the BABA applies to again, it's like every widget that goes into a project needs to adhere to the BABA requirements, the built in America, made in America, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a couple of links here, which when you download the presentation, you will you can click on those. They are lovely EPA documents that talk about how they're going to implement BABA. Similarly to AIS, there are thresholds that the components need to meet in order to sort of trigger the BABA requirement. So they are listed here. I'm not going to read the slide. Similarly to AIS, there are waivers that exist. It should be noted that whereas AIS has sort of, like I said, in various iterations existed since around 2009, BABA only applies to projects that I don't want to confuse you on the language, but essentially there is a cutoff date, and I think it's May 15th 2022. It will say it in one of those memos, but essentially if a quote agreement was in place, or if the project was already designed, like basically in sort of in the pipeline, then BABA doesn't apply because they're like, well, you guys were already planning for a certain dollar value and certain widgets to be included in your project that didn't have to conform to BABA. So you're already kind of in the queue, you're in line, so we're not going to make this apply. After that date, however, projects will need to comply. So waivers exist, de minimis exists, and national waivers exist. This is another federal cross-cutter that applies to any type of federal money. This used to be more of a requirement where states had to meet certain thresholds of DBEs, or disadvantaged business enterprises, that were provided funding. They've switched it up, and it is now a, well, you got to make a good faith effort. So this is the six-step good faith effort to ensure that DBEs, MBEs, and WBEs are afforded an opportunity to bid on projects. Again, there is no requirement that a community or an engineering firm choose a DBE, WBE, or MBE, but that they at least go through these steps to ensure that the consultants or contractors are made aware of the projects. I'm just zooming right along here. I thought I was going to take longer. So this is another requirement, signage. Basically, it says that, hey, we want to be recognized. EPA wants to be recognized for providing the funding for the project. And the signs can come in different ways. So, for example, this is a typical sign that you'll see on the side of a road by a water project. Sometimes the notification of funding can come through like a bill stuffer, or I've even seen it on people's website, on communities' websites, where there's just some type of acknowledgement that the project, who the project was funded by. This requirement and the way it's going to be met will be outlined in your bid documents. So there will be pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of bid documents, and there may be one paragraph in there that talks about signage. Telecom is another one of these fun little requirements. Basically, it's saying that federal funds shall not be used in specific covered telecommunications equipment or services. You can see the covered brands here. As you can see, there's a theme to the types of brands that are covered. Essentially, they are Chinese made, and we want to avoid having that, not avoid, thou shall not use those types of equipments, that thou shall not use equipment that is made in China and funded through SRF in their system. Lastly, there is a requirement that if a borrower, and this applies to any type of federal funds. So if a borrower, a political jurisdiction, an entity, spends or incurs more than $750,000 in federally reimbursable funds in their fiscal year, that entity must do a single audit for the year that they incurred those expenses. Now, to break it down a little bit, it means, again, incurred, not necessarily reimbursed for. And the $750,000 is across the entire political jurisdiction. So the community may be receiving funds from transportation, maybe receiving funds from education, Homeland Security, SRF, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just something to keep in mind when, especially with these really small communities that may be undertaking a large project for the first time, frankly, ever, and they are receiving $2 million in loan funds. Is there a way to maybe balance the project so it maybe straddles a fiscal year, for example, so that half of the project, okay, maybe not a $2 million project, because that would mean half the project's $1 million, but let's say a $1 million project, so maybe it could be straddled so that half of the costs are incurred in June, and then the other half of the costs are incurred in July, therefore sort of avoiding the $750,000 threshold. And the reason why this is important, or maybe not important, important's the wrong word, while this nuance may matter, is because a single audit is like audit on steroids. So it is not only a review of the financials, it is a review of the procedures of the organization to ensure that they are following, that they have adequate controls to meet the federal guidelines. And I know, at least for me in Vermont, many of the communities that I would work with hadn't even ever had a regular audit, much less a single audit. And so in addition to it being a significant financial burden, I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars, it is a labor, it's a commitment of sometimes volunteer treasurers. It is a commitment to produce policies, because sometimes the policies don't even exist, and so now the community has to draft policies because there's going to be findings. It just can create more work that frankly they may not even need to do if the state, meaning the SRF program, is strategic about who has to commit or who receives federal funds, and then how they receive it. So on to disbursement. I thought the single audit was the climax, but no, we're not. Here's disbursement. So again, top 5 things to remember. The SRF program is a reimbursement-based program. And what that means is it means the loan recipient has to incur the costs prior to receiving the funds. And again, the stress that this could put on a small community is significant, because I imagine those small communities do not have hundreds of thousands of dollars in a savings account sitting around waiting to pay the backhoe guy who dug the line to put in the sewer pipe. So what that means is it means a community may have to go after short-term financing. And that short-term financing could be from a local bank. But keep in mind that local bank is going to want to see that that the borrower has the financial capacity to borrow the short-term financing. The good thing is, and this has been my experience, is a letter from the SRF program sufficed, basically saying, yeah, on my honor, I'm giving these guys a loan, and you'll be able to get paid back once the borrower, submits to the state, me, for reimbursement. And they're going to get their money pretty quick. I mean, as long as the forms are filled out correctly and the accompanying material is there, and the person hasn't taken a 2-week vacation. So this is a really important thing to remember, is that reimbursement-based costs must be incurred, and that short-term financing is strongly recommended. So here is a summary, essentially, of all of the requirements that I spoke about. You may see more here than what I went over. It's because I kind of rolled a bunch of them up and glazed over some. Like I glazed over the socioeconomic and the civil rights, mostly because a lot of those are already in the loan agreements. And when you, the borrower, signs on a loan agreement, you're agreeing to a number of these cross-cutters. So there's no, I didn't feel like I needed to waste time on them. Credit, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This matrix was liberated from the SRF 101 training that EPA does. I beefed it up a little bit and added more links, but credit where credit is due. So 15 minutes left for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. So we do have a couple of questions that came in.
Okay.
And just a reminder to everyone else to go ahead and get your questions in if you have any. The first question is, for projects that must do a NEPA review, for example, not NEPA-like, on the initial outreach to stakeholder agencies, are comments required, including a no comment from all agencies before moving on to approval of the environmental review?
So I'm going to tell you how I did it in Vermont. So we had essentially an environmental report template that listed all of those, so that, I'm sorry if I'm, like, close your eyes until I say go, that listed all of these cross-cutter, all of these checks that you had to do. So it basically had a line for endangered species, and in Vermont we had a GIS database that the borrower engineer could essentially put on the endangered species layer, zoom into where the project was, and if there were endangered species there, print off, or whether there were not, print off a map and include that as part of the environmental report, to basically say, nope, and here's evidence that there isn't. So this would happen, that sort of thing would happen in almost all of these. Sometimes there would be an email from, like, the Fish and Wildlife person that says, yep, I looked at your project and no, there are no endangered fish or threatened fish in this area. Similarly on wetlands. So I would say that most states do a similar, approach it similarly, where they have you, the borrower, i.e. engineer, kind of compile all of the justification for, frankly, a Cat X, and give proof of that, and then the state reviews it. Does that answer that question?
I believe that you definitely answered that question.
Okay.
But we'll wait and see what he says.
Okay.
A lot of more questions have come in since then, so I'll go ahead and get it going. In the fiscal year for the single audit, or is the fiscal year for the single audit the federal fiscal year, state fiscal year, or ULG fiscal year?
It is the borrower's fiscal year. So perfect. A borrower could have a calendar fiscal year. So that's why it says costs incurred in the borrower's fiscal year.
And can you define cross-cutter?
Cross-cutter means a requirement that crosses many agencies. So so looking at this list, and I'm going to keep coming back to the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act goes across all federal funding programs. So that's what we mean by federal crosscutters. Whereas AIS only applies to EPA, SRF. That is not a crosscutter per se.
And does the Build America, Buy America Act apply to a state's base SRF funding?
It will apply to the federal portion of the state's SRF funding. I know you're like, I just want a yes or no answer, and I can't give you a yes or no answer because, like I said, there are a lot of sources of funding that make up state SRF programs, and federal money is just one portion of it. The repayment money is a significant portion of the available funds every year, and BABA does not apply, technically does not apply to repayment funds, but some states choose to apply all of these requirements to all of the projects. It's a nuance. It's a weird nuance, and you really have to, like, if you work in a specific state, then message me afterwards and we can talk about how a specific state implements it. So like Texas, for example, will choose a handful of states to apply some of these requirements to, like single audit, like BABA, like fiscal sustainability, like not fiscal sustainability. God, why am I blanking on this? Anyway, so there are a handful that Texas will choose at the onset to be like, you are the next contestant on the equivalency requirement. And as such, Texas will actually give an additional interest rate reduction on those projects because they know that complying with the equivalency requirements will end up costing the project more money.
All right, and the next question is state specific. I would love for my state, Michigan, to use categorical exclusions for pipe rehab and water main projects. Is there something in the federal requirements that I can point them to?
No, the short answer is no. So every state is different, and so what states will do is they will develop what's called a SERP, or a state environmental review procedure, which is the state's way of saying, okay, we looked at NEPA and we know we have to implement NEPA the way we want to. So Michigan will look at NEPA and say, all right, we see all of your requirements, but we're actually going to do it this way. And that's how it's identified in the SERP, or the State Environmental Review Procedure. It might be in statute, it might be in rule, it might be in the bottom drawer of somebody's desk. But the SERP will outline how a state chooses which projects qualify for CADX and which ones have to go for the full review. There are other states, like Mississippi says, okay, we're actually just going to go for a public notice on all of the projects. We're going to have a public hearing and we're going to public notice all of them. So Mississippi also doesn't do CADXs. It's maddening to me why they don't. I think the best you can do is sort of gently encourage through the public comment period and the intended use plan that, like, hey, it'd be really great if, but it's up to the state.
And that person responded, thank you. And this is the last question I see. Can you comment on the risks of going to construction before a community is officially approved for an SRF loan and then trying to get a loan after the fact?
Yeah, so I would say the risks are significant unless you have been working very closely with the state sort of regulatory, whoever is in charge of like reviewing bid docs and and so on and so forth. So in Vermont, I would say, sure, go ahead and do construction at your own risk, but it must be, quote, bid and procured as though it is being funded with SRF. So all of the things we talked about here today need to be followed if you have any hope of getting retroactive funding through the SRF program. And I know that's tough to hear because some states are so far behind in approving projects, much less loans. And you're like, dude, we need to do the project yesterday. We have the contractor line up. We don't want to have any change orders. It's going to add to it. I get it. But just to know that you are advancing at your own risk, and especially if you haven't taken into consideration all of these requirements.
Awesome. Ashley, thank you so much for your insights and sharing your expertise with us today. Was there something else you were going to add on?
I think I was going to be related to that. Oh, I was going to say also many states are probably not interested in doing retroactive funding just because it's a lot of work for them as well. So so that they may be like, hey, if you go ahead with construction, we're actually not going to fund you.
Right. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks again
That's
for sharing your
No
expertise with us. That's it. That's all the questions we have right now. Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean,
we got a comment. Someone said thank you so much for the great info. Great presentation. Following this webinar today, each of the audience members will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording. Also, there's going to be a webinar evaluation following the webinar. So please let us know your thoughts on today's session. This helps us plan future webinars that are on topics important to you. I'm getting a lot of great info, great presentation. So thank you again, Ashley. We really appreciate you spending your time and being with us today. And thank you all for being here today. We hope to see you at future EFCN events.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.